This is the Lord Dunsany panel. Or is it Dunsany? I always forget. Dunsany, thank you. See, I start by thinking it's the one that I know. I correct myself and re-correct myself back to where I started. My name is Jason Thompson. I've always been a huge fan of Lovecraft's dream stories, and through them I discovered Lord Dunsany. And we have today a star-studded lineup of Dunsany scholars and experts, and I think let's begin. Some people aren't here yet, but let's begin by having our roaster introduce themselves, beginning from the right.
All right. My name is Martin Andersson. I teach Swedish and English at the Swedish High School. I think it's on. I've been a Dunsany fan since about the age of 14. I'm probably the least published person on this panel. I've written a brief biographical sketch of Dunsany in Swedish. But I have done some bibliographical work. I found some Dunsany appearances in various newspaper archives. And I'm a friend of Dunsany's family, so I have, for the past 4 years, I have been visiting them every summer and looking at the manuscripts at the castle.
You're lucky.
My name is Kifalopo, writer, book reviewer. As so often at this excellent convention, I'm getting a bit of imposter syndrome here because I just like reading Dunsany. I've never tackled him critically. You know, I try to trace the influence in Lovecraft's work, but basically just coming at him from my perspective as a fan of his writing.
I'm Faye Ringle, and I used to be a professor at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, but I did my graduate work at Brown, and Dunsany was part of my dissertation back in the late 70s, at a time when nobody on my committee had ever heard of him, and there really was very little written about him. And in fact, St. Joshi, who is arriving right now, when he compiled this really comprehensive volume of critical essays on Lord Dunsany, he really surveyed just about everything ever written on Dunsany, and there was this huge gap between the time of his life when he was reviewed all the time, and even after he was republished in the Valentine Adult Fantasy series. So, say between the 30s and the 70s, there was just like nothing written at all. So I kind of was trying to remedy that gap. I'm looking forward to hearing from the scholars who have done the primary research. Actually, you can't get any more primary than staying in Dunsany Castle.
And we were introducing our panelists. To my left is St. Joshi.
Yeah, of course. So I've been very lucky to have been able to do work on Lord Dunsany and indeed to visit the castle, although Martin has visited many more times, but we'll get into that later. And I'm glad to have been able to get some of Dunsany's work back into print, the Jorkin stories, for example. After many years, I twisted my Penguin editor's arms to do a Penguin Classics edition of Dunsany, and it did surprisingly well. It's really still in print. I have this. I'm working on an edition. Get a load of this of his collected plays, which are magnificent, and the book will come with like 1,000 pages. He wrote like 50, 60 plays over his career. It's wonderful stuff. So, and I did a critical study and a bibliography, so Dunsany's my guy.
So, how many of you here have read Lord Dunsany? Nice. All right. Faye, I'm glad that you started talking a bit about Dunsany's, how his fame has ebbed and flowed like the tides over his lifetime and after his death. Because just a brief background, of course, he lived from 1878 to 1957, and in that time he had many different phases of writing, and his literary status, I believe, was such that he was considered he was a friend, wasn't he, and a contemporary, and considered an equal of Yeats, wasn't he?
Yes, he knew Yeats personally, and it was actually Yeats who got him to write his first play, The Glittering Gate, which was performed in 1909, I think it was, at the Abbey Theatre.
And that was at that point he'd already started written The Gods of Pegana and some of his other early mythological type works, hadn't he?
Yes, and Yeats wrote the introduction to the collected volume, to one of his early collected volumes of those. So yeah, when you get Yeats to write your words, you're in good company.
I think in fact that was the only collection of any other writer's work that Yeats edited.
While Daryl's settling down and getting a chance to introduce himself, I think we need, it just dawned on me, we need a mnemonic for the pronunciation of Dunsany, because there have been some famous ones. There was James Branch Cabell used to, when people were confused, he'd say, "Tell the rabble my name is Cabell." And Fritz Leiber used to say, "Leiber rhymes with scriber," which is, so we need something like
Dunsany rhymes with rainy.
Right, there you go. Fun and zany, that's Dunsany.
And I wish somebody tell Neil Gaiman that it's Dunsany, not Dunsany. He says that throughout his his little thing, at least on this documentary on Lovecraft that he participated in.
It's totally insane. Is that your animal?
Daryl, introduce yourself.
I am Daryl Schweitzer. Well, for those of you with the prayer breakfast, you know me. I was the deacon. Anyway, I am a writer, former editor of Weird Tales, and what is probably more immediately relevant here is that I wrote the first book-length study of Dunsany, Pathways to Elfland, about which I will say that it's not as up-to-date or as profound as ST's, but it's a lot cheaper.
When did that come out, Daryl?
It was 89. And additionally, my other Dunsany credits are 89. My other Dunsany credits are that I edited a book of his uncollected stories and essays called The Ghost of the Heaviside Layer in 1980. And in 2004, I edited a book of uncollected and unpublished plays called The Ginger Cat, which rendered something I said in this book obsolete because I was speculating whether or not the manuscript of The Ginger Cat still existed, and lo and behold it did, and I actually published it. But in those days, well, I was drawing this up. I was not in contact with the Dunsany estate or anything. I was just drawing this stuff out of libraries. So all I can say is I'm the first person. I guess I scratched the surface, or the person who went, like the person who explored the West with and drew a map with a pencil. Well, it's the first one.
So, how did you discover Dunsany? Because I read the Valentine Fancy editions in my dad's collection that Lynn Carter had edited. But how did you all find out about this author?
One word: Lovecraft.
Yes, exactly.
Lovecraft.
Yeah. Usually an introduction in a Lovecraft collection. They'll talk about his Dunsanian stories, and you say, "What's a Dunsanian story?" And then you read the names in your brain, and then a little while later, I found a copy of A Dreamer's Tales in the thrift shop for a dime.
Yeah, again, as I might remark on the Smith panel, I started, I wouldn't say systematically, but when I read supernatural horror literature, I said, a lot of writers in here that I would like to, look at least. And luckily enough, again, this was in my both the public library in Muncie, Indiana, and the Ball State University library there, had a fair amount of Dunsany, and I found some of the John W. Luce editions, which indeed had some of the great Sidney Syme illustrations. Those were spectacular. That combination of Dunsany's prose and Syme's illustrations was really a magical way to get into Dunsany.
When we were kids, those books were common.
They were.
That was the copy I found for a dime in the thrift shop even had a dust jacket.
Wow. I discovered Dunsany at the very same time I discovered Lovecraft, because they both appeared in an anthology I read when I was 11. And it was the story Helping the Fairies, which had its first book appearance actually in Swedish in 1959, so it was quite cool. But it didn't make that much of an impression at the time because I was too overwhelmed by the color out of space. So, but then I discovered a selection of tales from the Book of Wonder and Tales of Wonder that was published in Swedish in 1989, and that really won me over. So I sort of snuck in from the side, not by way of Lovecraft.
Well, basically, I'm Jason's father because I read the Valentine books when they first came out, and if I had had any children, they would have been sitting there on the shelf waiting for them. So, yeah, that was those Valentine editions. The adult fantasy line was just seminal, I think, for so many people.
But did anyone in this audience discover Dunsany before discovering Lovecraft? What? One. Oh my lord.
Two.
Wow.
Well, the Dunsany people need to hear that.
That's right.
They didn't realize how much they owe to Lovecraft.
No.
But he's the gateway drug for so many things.
I mean, to think about it, Dunsany was born 12 years before Lovecraft, lived 20 years after him, and now he's sort of overshadowed by this guy who was totally obscure in his own day. It's a very bizarre occurrence. And, you know, I mean, there was Dunsany, as we sort of alluded to earlier, especially in his later work in the 20s, 30s, 40s, was reviewed by, I mean, if you look at my bibliography, there are reviews of Dunsany's books by Evelyn Waugh and Elizabeth Bowen and Robert Penn Warren and Graham Greene, and it's like, wow, they all liked Dunsany. I mean, they're not all favorable reviews, but those magazines, The Spectator or New Statesman, you know, they felt the need to have important reviewers review these books.
I was just going to say the whole arc of posthumous careers is fascinating and could constitute a whole panel in itself. We were talking about Yeats giving a blurb to Dunsany. I once picked up a novel by, I believe the fellow's name was Ludwig Lewison, someone rather forgotten today, and the front cover blurb was from Freud. And I'm saying, man, if you get a blurb from Freud, I think that's, you know, going to indicate your status.
One thing is Dunsany became like a standard school title, and particularly the plays. I can remember even in The Catcher in the Rye, you know, the kid talks about reading the plays of Lord Dunsany. I think if you were in school up to about 1950, you might have even had him in school. Dunsany mentioned, he picked up some book on playwriting, and the opening line was, "The art of the play, from Aeschylus to Lord Dunsany is," and he stopped reading it.
One of the first film, or at least the first major film in which Katharine Hepburn appeared, it was 1933, I forgot the name of it, where she plays a young stage actress trying to get ahead in the world. And the little clip I saw in a Hepburn documentary.
Is that with Cary Grant?
I believe so. She said, yeah, I fear, you know, I was in this play, I was in this play. I played the Queen in Dunsany's The Queen's Enemies. I mean, wow.
Yeah, that's a great film.
It was just a standard, again, actually this is something you can tell from the used bookstores. The reason those books are so common is they were extremely standard for a long time. And
well, as far as the plays go, I can attest that Dunsany's one-act play, The Jest of Hahalava, which is one of his most reprinted plays, was chosen to appear in Random House's best one-act plays of the 20th century. And that anthology remains in print, and when I started teaching in the 1980s, was still widely assigned in college courses.
It was made into the film called It Happened Tomorrow. Renee Claire, was it?
Yes.
I've not actually seen that film.
I have.
I've seen the television version of A Night at the End. There was one. A program called Thriller, but not the one you're thinking of. It was about 1949, and Boris Karloff played the top. I found there is a disc of this available. Otherwise, it was 5 episodes. 2 or 3 of them were based on Robert Louis Stevens, and it's really primitive early television. But this was just a standard drama. I've met people basically of the generation older than me who saw it in school or something. Apparently, one of the reasons that Night at the End was so popular in schools was because it had an all-male cast. And so it was a standard one for boys' schools.
And prisons.
So it was easy to put on.
But The film that happened tomorrow was 1944, and by coincidence, TCM just aired it a couple of months ago. I watched it then, and it had A-list cast, Dick Powell, Linda Darnell, and it retains the core of the Dunsany play, but obviously turns it into this 3-act
I mean,
fantasy.
Dunsany is credited, is he?
He
Or-
is. He
Yeah.
is credited for the Jest of Kifalopo.
Okay.
Well, as long, somehow we drifted into media, which is good, but what's the, now I'm blanking on the latest adaptation because I haven't seen
Dean's
it.
Family.
Dean
Yes.
Stanley.
Wonderful film.
Yeah.
But I
Theater
gather
tool.
that it's actually quite, I gather it really expands extremely
It
upon
adds-
the original work. It really
it
is sort
adds-
of revisionist.
It adds thematic material which isn't in the original work. It's actually a much more substantial story than the original work.
I really enjoyed it.
Could this possibly presage wider interest in?
Well, I'll tell you.
How did that? I wonder how that ever made it.
Okay, I'll tell you.
With great stealth.
Yeah, I have no idea how they decided to do that one, but I have always thought that King of Elfland's Daughter would make a spectacular fantasy film, either live action, maybe animated. I probably would prefer live action, but we got to get something like Neil Gaiman to back it or write the screenplay or something. Even that wasn't that there was some sort of rock opera or something like.
Yes.
There was
The
a
concept, it was a concept album called The King
Which
of
is
Elfland's
also
Daughter.
fantastic and beautiful. Actually, it brought tears to my eyes at some point.
It starts out as it's a 33 RPM, and I think it's now available on.
It's on CD.
Christopher Lee is reading in it.
Yeah.
He plays the king, and he also is the narrator.
The problem with the having it, as you said, with Neil Gaiman and having it made it as a film is that many people think it already was as Stardust, because Stardust was so much inspired by the King of Elfland's Daughter, and even that was not, it was not very successful. I mean, Gaiman and all those involved with it, for some reason it just did not have the commercial success of some of the other Gaiman film projects. So I don't know, that might go against a kind of commercial.
You have to remember that even somebody as big and as famous as Neil Gaiman is still small potatoes in Hollywood.
Yeah.
Well, it's fascinating also that Dunsany has done so many plays, so many novels, so much poetry, but Lovecraft's experience with him, which is probably the entry point for 99% of people today, was his fascination was entirely with Dunsany's early pseudo-mythological stories. And I'm wondering how the other panelists feel about these stories and and how they stand within the canon, I guess, of Dunsany's work, and also how he felt about them since he moved on into several different phases in his writing life.
Well, yeah, we have to recall that the so-called Pagana, or Pagana, however you pronounce it, mythos, as I have termed it, constitutes only two books. The first two books, The Gods of Pagana and Time of the Gods. He basically gave up that specific kind of pseudo-mythological writing in his later work. Occasionally, well, he returned to it in a little trilogy of stories with Idle Days on the Yawn and The Shop and Go By Street and The Avenger of Bedonders. But basically, that was it. And this really was something new in literature. I can't find any antecedents, really speaking, in previous literature for something who created a whole theogony out of whole cloth. It's a tremendous imaginative achievement, and you can understand why Lovecraft was fascinated with it. Although he did not actually read those two books first, he read A Dreamer's Tales first, and that's where he says he was struck as if by an electric shock when reading that prose of that book. But then again went back to those early volumes, and then in his autobiography, his brief autobiography, Some Knows How to Not an Entity, he says, yeah, I basically got the idea for my pseudo-mythology, namely the Cthulhu mythos, from Lord Dunsany. Meaning that, I think, that he took that framework of a series of imagined gods, but instead of keeping it in a fantasy world, a world of imagination, as Dunsany had done, thrust it into the real world where the focus becomes very different. He goes from fantasy to supernatural horror by that gesture, and that's a significant alteration.
It's intriguing to me, ST, that you mentioned no precedence for this, because I just did a small review for the Barnes Noble review where my stuff appears, And it was a fantasy novel that I'm blanking on right now, but there was an elaborate mythology. And I mentioned in this piece that it's de rigueur to create your pantheons and your theogony for, you know, your typical fantasy trilogy, and some do it to a greater extent, some it's foregrounded, some it's just background stuff. But you know, the commercialism of these big fantasy trilogies, to have this element of Dunsany in them kind of unacknowledged.
And they probably don't know it. The authors themselves probably don't know. An awful lot of newer fantasy writers don't even know the name. You know, they're inheriting things that they don't know. But anyways, I want to answer the question, how did Dunsany feel about his early work? Well, first of all, as for how it holds up, it just reads aloud. You just read it aloud forever. It does, you know, there's nothing will ever fade there. In 1954, Dunsany brought out a Best of Dunsany book, which is called The Sword of Welleran and Other Tales of Enchantment. And he included The Sword of Welleran and Idle Days on the Am and a couple other, I think The Bride of the Man Horse, who he certainly, in what he considered to be a very short volume of his very best stories, he put several of these in. So he didn't exactly disown them.
But the earliest volume, we really can't even call them stories. The earliest, even before the Gods of Ghana, are really prose poems. And that was, I think, if he had any precedents, it was the fashion for prose poetry, both in Ireland and in France in the late 19th century. But they tended not to be fantastic. What his genius was to take that form, but apply it to his totally invented geography and cosmology.
What may seem strange is that Dunsany himself apparently wasn't that keen on the fantastic himself. His reading tastes ran mostly to the English classics. He was passionate about Keats, for example. He mentions in his autobiography that he read the Brothers Grimm and Edgar Allan Poe as a child. And of course he was related to Sir Richard Burton, so he must have known the Arabian Nights at an early age as well. But he mostly read the classics. He was a fan of The Worldly Worlds by H.G. Wells and knew Wells personally. And he also read Algernon Blackwood and knew Blackwood. There is a fun reference in Mike Ashley's biography of Blackwood, how Blackwood and Dunsany would go tobogganing on Dunsany's silver tea trays. I think Dunsany was in his 40s at the time, and then Blackwood was in his 50s, so it must have been fun to watch these big rides of the weird.
That happens in right here in Providence on College Hill. When the streets get closed, the lunch trays come out from RISD and Brown.
When I personally read Dunsany's early fantasy works, what I see is that in the early ones, like the Gods of Ghana, it's basically very, very serious and very solemn mythology. Like it's very King James Bible. But then as he goes on, sort of beginning with the Dreamer's Tales, and then increasingly with the Book of Wonder, it's sort of like, to me, that he goes through the phases of infatuation and then ironic disillusionment with the fantasy genre. Because the stories, they start to get a little weird and like, hey, I'm just joking with you. And then by the end, they're really just like, I'm going to make up a really silly name and this story is going to end now. But
he started a self-parody. I think of how Plashku came to the land of none's desire. It's very, and the Lovecraft didn't like this. In fact, if you read in Silver Key, we're talking about, there's something about how Randolph Carter, wrote these beautiful fantasies and then he started to trash them. And I think he's really talking about Dunsany. I mean, otherwise you have to be talking about James Branch Cabell, and Lovecraft didn't care about James Branch Cabell, so clearly Dunsany. Dunsany just moved more into irony, and he would come back. Obviously, The King of Elfland's Daughter is a serious attempt to really capture that all over again, but he started to parody himself.
One quick note before we move on to the later work, which I think is fabulous also, but that autobiography, Patches of Sunlight, you really ought to read it. That's his first autobiography. The other next two are not so interesting, but that one is a magical treatment of Dunsany's early life and career. Just beautifully written. Anyway, he does say there that at his boys' school, and then maybe at Sandhurst, the military academy he attended. He did start studying Greek, but really never got very good in Greek. And he said something like, well, maybe it's that my failure to learn Greek and to understand, fully participate in Greek mythology is what led me to create my own mythology. So like, I can't get to the Greeks, but I can do something similar to them.
I can mention one good thing about the later autobiographies, with the limerick contest,
Yes.
which I think is the second one.
Yeah.
He was on a ship somewhere, and somebody proposed a contest, and they wrote the first line, which I think was a young thing on a ship, and everybody wrote continuation of it. And Dunsany reproduces in the book several that he wrote in the manner of Poe, Milton, Edgar Allan Poe,
Or like Hemingway.
My favorite was the Walt Whitman limerick.
Yes.
Dunsany,
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it basically ends with, it starts out as a limerick, and the last two lines are something like, and the last two lines don't rhyme because I'm a manly man and not bound by the strictures of your moribund civilization.
But anyway.
He was able to write poems at the drop of the hat. Lady Dunsany told me a funny story about how he had been out hunting with a younger relative, and suddenly he got an idea for a poem, and so he tore a piece of paper out of a notebook that he had, but he didn't have a pen or ink with him, so he crushed up some berries, and with a stick he wrote out the poem. And apparently that relative still has that berry written poem.
Well, you should probably clarify that you're not speaking of his wife.
Who is the current lady?
The current
The current Lady Dunsany is the widow of his grandson.
But anyway, yeah, Mark and I have seen many of Dunsany's manuscripts at Dunsany Castle, and as he himself said, he almost never revised, whether it be prose, poetry, essays, fiction, whatever. Everything almost was a first draft. He got it right the first time. It's amazing. But he wrote in all kinds of different pens, inks, pencil, crayon sometimes. And we have.
He didn't type.
He himself did not type. Well, maybe he did a little bit. Mostly he had a secretary that he sent out this stuff to type, because when it comes back, you can see the little label by the stenographer.
Back to humor for a second. I think on another panel you mentioned that Lovecraft hated the Jorkin stories.
Yeah, he called them tripe. Oof, pretty harsh. But Lovecraft didn't like the mingling of humor and fantasy or horror or imagination. But I think Dunsany pulls off that trick magnificently, not only in those Jorkin's tales, but in many other of the later works. In my critical study, published in 1995, I expressed a certain irritation with some readers and critics who really focused, Lovecraft is one of them, focus on that early work, from the Gods of Pagana to basically Tales of the Three Hemispheres in 1919, and pay almost no attention to the stuff that Dunsany wrote the subsequent 3 or 4 decades of his career, which I think is maybe not quite as unique, but still extremely, evocative, brilliant in its own way. Whether it be novels like King of Athai's Daughter, or even things like Blessing of Pan, the Curse of the Wise Woman, the story of Bonashihi, and one of my great favorites, totally obscure and forgotten, The Strange Journeys of Colonel Polders in 1950. Maybe we'll talk about that a little later. But so he wrote all these novels. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of short stories, lots and lots of poems. Not the greatest poet in the world, kind of like Lovecraft in that way. Some very interesting essays. I mean, it's an enormous body of work, and really ought to be appreciated.
And even some of the early Jorkin stories still have, like the King of Sareb, some of them have the early manner or something very close to it. And they become more jokes later on, I think, and they become less fantastic later on. I think Lovecraft really would have hated the last couple volumes of Jorkins, but he didn't live to see those. But the others, there are 2 science fiction novels, including the recently discovered and published
Pleasures of a Futuroscope.
which is actually surprising.
It's actually not bad at all.
It was in 1955. So he was how old was he?
Oh, 75, 77.
And it's beautiful passages in that.
ST, what's the status of all those later stories? I mean, I can't, were they ever collected in his lifetime?
Well, Martin can tell you more, but he assembled a volume in 1956, didn't have a title for it, but a very strong collection of his later work, but just didn't get it published.
But are there dozens like that had magazine appearances and are just sitting
There
there?
are hundreds of uncollected stories, uncollected or unpublished stories.
You may remember, I read as many of them as possible in Weird Tales. And, well, there's a late collection, Man Awake to Phoenix, which actually does contain work back as far back as about 1920, but it contains some later work.
Yeah.
And then there's a mystery collection, Little Tales of Smethers, which has one fantasy in it. And then, of course, well, there are actually now 6 Jorkins volumes.
Yeah, there was a sixth Jorkins book that again, also he never got a chance to publish, but we did that.
You and Martin and ST have been going through uncatalogued and unpublished papers. Do you have any secrets for us?
Yes.
In a word,
He'd have to kill us if he told.
Well, actually, I can also...
Can you tantalize us?
Yeah, well, there are lots of unpublished stories. For example, I can mention that when Dunsany published 51 Tales in 1915, he actually had to cut it quite severely.
that was a collection of his prose poems.
Yeah, he originally intended it. He originally intended it as 70 tales. That's what it says on all the envelopes containing the manuscripts. But due to paper shortage, he had to cut some of them. And I think he actually wrote something around 90 to begin with, and then started culling. So those, all those like 40-something stories, none of them have been published before. There are plans to publish them eventually, but we'll see how it goes.
I should mention that when Daryl and I first did our bibliography back in 1993, it was almost, I mean, there we were focusing on published work, we didn't even know about all this unpublished stuff, but it was almost kind of like a treasure hunt, because we simply didn't know what was out there. Nobody did. And we would spend many hours, let's say, in the University of Pennsylvania Library, where you just, at that time, you just walk in, and we would just look through whole runs of periodicals, just hoping to find stuff by that. And we did often.
We did, yeah, basically, yeah, in those days they let riffraff like us into the stacks. Into the periodical stacks at the University of Penn Library. We just, walk in and
They have all these
we just say, oh,
volumes of
here's a magazine I've never heard of. I wonder if there's something in there. And I remember we found a magazine called Tomorrow, which was a sort of like British Atlantic Monthly or something, a general magazine. And there were several good stories in that one. And then we found something called Queen's Quarterly I'd never heard of. Several more. And so we just started looking for general literary type magazines.
He published a lot early in the British Saturday Review. This was way before the American Saturday Review was founded in the 20s. The British Saturday Review goes actually all the way back to like 1860s, but it was a very highly regarded
but it was more like a tabloid.
paper.
I remember the volumes
Well, they were quite
long.
large. That's all right, but no, it was a distinguished literary magazine.
Well, I mean, the point is that being a tabloid, it was harder to preserve it. So we were lucky to actually find a volume of those.
But that's where a lot of the uncollected prose poems that would have gone into 70 Tales appeared, and we collected a bunch of those, because, for example, they would be published in a batch, like 3 or 4 of them in a single appearance. And then when Dunsany came to publish his collection, well, he'd use this one and this one and this one, but he left out that one and that one.
One funny bit of irony, basically the exploration of Dunsany is the constant discovery that the iceberg is larger than you thought it was. In the introduction to the Ghosts of Heaviside Layer, I would carefully hedge my bets and left open the possibility that I missed a couple. And this basically started with me trying to collect Dunsany in old magazines. Because I had grown up paging through old magazines, largely because my family went on vacation to Maine every summer, and at least in those days, every junk shop in Maine had vast quantities of 19th century and early 20th century periodicals for pennies. And so I was finding stuff, and I started making notes of how many of them there were. And when I got to college, I started to find, they had periodical indexes, kind of, and I started hunting down what they might have there, and I remember I found one in the Smart Set anthology. I never found the magazine, but I found the story. And I started to collect these, and at one point I naively thought I had them all. And I also noticed there were a couple of uncollected stories in fantasy and science fiction in the 50s. Notably Ghost of Heaviside Lair.
And Queens also.
Yeah, but that's one of the first thing that taught me that, well, maybe there are more, is that I found from the back, after the book was done and published, then I found from the back of Beyond and Ellery Queens. I hadn't had access to an index to Ellery Queens. I later wrote to the editor of Ellery Queens and asked for what they had. And this got me to Two Men in a Garden. But yes, there was actually a moment back there in time, in the early Pleistocene, when I actually thought I had them all. This will never happen again.
Yes.
So we've talked about the search for obscure Dunsany. What are the Dunsany stories or plays which you feel are underappreciated or his best fate?
Well, of course, I mean, the King of Elfland's Daughter is not underappreciated. It is definitely appreciated, and by everyone in this room, maybe. But as everybody's been saying, it's amazing how many writers of fantasy and science fiction don't know of it, even though it's been in print more consistently, I think, than any of his other novels. But along with that, I really do love the Chronicles of Rodriguez. It's appeared in several different titles. It was also reprinted in the Valentine Adult Fantasy series. I don't know, we'll have to have one of the bibliographers tell us if it's in print again.
It is, why? Because
As
it
Don
is public
Rodriguez.
domain in the U.S.
Oh.
There are lots of crappy print-on-demand editions of that, because it's 1922.
Really?
King of Elfland, no, Rodriguez.
Oh, Rodriguez.
Rodriguez.
1922, that was his first novel. It is public domain in the U.S. None of his other novels are.
If we ever do a third volume of a third version of the bibliography, my job seems to be devolving on to, because since these guys go to Dunsany Castle, I'm the watcher of eBay, and what I do is to get on eBay and look up Dunsany and look for the editions I've never heard of, and try to find out what
lots,
they are.
because all that early work of Dunsany is in the public domain in the U.S.
I saw another one in the
Lots of
Illustrator.
awful editions of
There was
it.
a guy who had a rather nice Gods of Pagana, but he colorized the plates.
Oh.
It looked nice, but it isn't authentic. It was a handsome edition.
About the King of Elfland's Daughter, again, I should say, familiar title to us, but I wanted to use it for a fantasy discussion series that I've been running at a library in Connecticut, and there were no titles of it in the entire Connecticut library system, so we couldn't use it.
That's because there hasn't been a hardcover in a while.
That's right.
Right.
The last hardcover was actually the Tom Stacy reprint in the 70s.
Right, and not one of the libraries.
But there are lots of trade paperbacks, a lot of paperbacks.
So everyone, who else likes King of Elfland's Daughter the best?
I also like Traveling Shadow a lot,
Yes.
and The Curse of the Wise Woman a lot.
Yeah.
And I'd also put in a word for Man Who Ate the Phoenix, which has never been reprinted as far as
Yeah, let me talk about this delightful, strange journeys of Colonel Polders, which was published quite late, in 1950. I think it was only in a UK edition, right? There was no US edition, so that's why it's pretty hard to find or hasn't been read much. It's sort of a vast expansion of my talks with Dean's family, in which the premise of that book, a very short novel, is that this clergyman believes that he has been a dog in a past life. Very clever premise, but it's a very charming piece of work. Colonel Polders expands upon that radically by conjecturing that there's a club in London, and this colonel, very bluff English colonel, has offended an Indian member, my type of Indian, Indian member of the club, a guy named Sinadriana or something like that. And this guy casts a spell on Colonel Polders that forces his spirit to occupy successively the bodies of all different kinds of animals, not just common ones like dogs or cats or whatever, but eels and foxes. I mean, there's one passage where Colonel Polders is in the body of a fox who is in a fox hunt. Yeah. Oh man, that is one of the most incredible passages. In fact, Colonel Polders has a very dry, understated manner of speaking about these experiences, and he said he's describing this fox hunt, and he says, "There's nothing quite like it when you're being chased by these dogs." Anyway, and one after the other, it's a bewildering, kaleidoscopic work of fantasy and imagination in which Dunsany has this uncanny ability to imagine what it is like to be one of these animals, and it's
He's a
just
very fine nature writer.
well, I hope we get into this. He was a pioneering environmentalist. He was a pioneering advocate of food safety or pure food. He was a pioneering advocate of animal rights. I mean, this guy was really ahead of his time.
Although he blasted a good deal of the wildlife, but he wrote a poem about how the birds would really be glad to see him gone.
Yes, he was also an indefatigable hunter, and well, expressed in many places that he really did feel that the only way you could understand animals was from the point of view of a hunter, because it gave you some kind of empathy for the hunted. So it's no wonder that.
Well, Martin can describe all the
trophies?
heads that are in Dunsany Castle.
Oh, tell us about that.
Yeah, there are plenty of them. Stuffed lion and various gazelles and antelopes and such. And he did keep a hunting diary where he listed everything that he shot, and that was one of his primary sources for the later 2 volumes of his autobiography, and that's why they sometimes devolve into these safari descriptions. So I shot this and I shot that. I would like to point out the Curse of the Wise Woman as an underappreciated novel. Published in 1933, I think, and it has a bit of a funny background, because William Butler Yeats had founded the Irish Academy, and he had 2 levels of membership, full members and associate members. And full members were those who wrote about Ireland, and associate members were everybody else. And at the time, Lord Dunsany hadn't written anything about Ireland, so he ended up being an associate member, and he was very annoyed about that. He said that if you had an Italian academy on these premises, with these rules, Dante wouldn't be in it. So he went ahead and wrote The Curse of the Wise Woman, which I think won him the Harmsworth Award, and so he became a full member finally.
Then he wrote a whole series of Irish novels going through Monasheehy.
That curse, yeah, the story of Monasheehy is also pure delight. But it's in that phase of Dunsany's career, which is almost like a kind of a negation of the fantastic. But there's still a fantastic element. The idea is that this young woman, Monasheehy, believes she is a child of the fairies, when in fact Dunsany makes it entirely clear that she is the illegitimate daughter of a noble woman, who had an affair with a young, working class person. But because Mona thinks she is, a sort of a supernatural being, that governs all the events of her life, and it becomes a kind of a psychological fantasy instead of an actual fantasy.
Another one of these is called Up in the Hills, which I think has a great opening chapter. I don't actually like the rest of the book that much, but the opening chapter is that a newly independent African nation, in order to prove that it is a real nation among nations, sends an expedition to Ireland to dig up, ancient, bog ruins and study the quaint native customs. And the African archaeologists are working with this, but they've disturbed too many things, and they've disturbed the fairies, and therefore the Irish witches are throwing curses back and forth, and everybody's afraid of ricocheting curses, and therefore the protagonist has to get out of town because there are too many ricocheting curses running around. And the rest of the book, it goes off, it's a sort of a comedy about the Troubles. I'm not sure how well it can go down in Ireland nowadays.
Yeah.
It might be described as Tom Sawyer meets Sinn Féin. And it's frankly not very convincing after that point, but the opening chapter is wonderful.
And then there's that work, Rory and Bran.
Oh, yes.
Oh man. That's one extended joke, but it's a very cleverly done joke. This Irish boy, which one is which? Rory is the boy. And the way Dunsany describes it, you think Bran is just another boy or somebody. It turns out to be a dog. And he never lets you know that until maybe the very end, or maybe never, but eventually you work it out. You work it out. But again, it's part of Dunsany's whole sort of back to nature thing. I mean, his whole work is really a sort of a back to nature manifesto, in that these two creatures, man and dog, are so in harmony with nature that it doesn't matter whether they're called a man or a dog, because they are such natural parts of their environment.
And they both drink out of puddles.
There was, I would like to add something about Rory and Bran there. There was a reviewer who apparently never got that Bran was a dog. So he wrote in his review something that there is something wrong with that Bran fellow. Because he jumps around and drinks out of puddles.
It doesn't say very much.
Yeah, he said he's awfully taciturn for an Irishman.
Well, that's a great theme. One of my absolute, I'll tell my favorite Dunsany story in a second, but one of my favorite SF stories is Desertion by Clifford Simak, which is a man and a dog bioengineered to exist on the surface of Jupiter. And the ending of it kills me every time, because they realize life in these alien avatars is so great on the surface of Jupiter, they refuse to go back and report on the mission. And the ending of the story is the dog says, "I can't go back, they'll turn me back into a dog," and the man says, "and me into a man." And it's just that, that bond between them that I don't know the Dunsany Rory and Bran. It's going to make me search it out now, just because I love that Simak story so much. My favorite Dunsany story has to be Idle Days on the Yan, and it's just, and I think it appeals to me because I don't write that way myself, and it's like, how does he achieve these marvelous effects? And it just, if he had written that one story, I think he'd be remembered today. Obviously it's like a one-hit wonder kind of guy, but that one story is imperishable, I think.
And the incredible thing is,
Gates said the same thing about
it looks, it looks as if it's, sort of an imaginative extrapolation of this voyage that he took down the Nile, but he wrote it before he went down the Nile. It's like he was anticipating what he might see on this.
I want to mention, you mentioned the Sidney Seam drawings. There's an illustration for Idle Days on the Yan, and I'm blanking on the artist's name. It was a fellow who, I guess he was a magazine illustrator at the time, but he worked in pen and ink, but it was that style where there were like 1 million lines per square inch, and I'm blanking on it. It's a beautiful illustration.
The sign or scene, actually it's pronounced scene.
Yeah.
Well, he did a rather famous illustration of that for the Dreamer's Tales.
Right, but this is another artist who just did a remarkable. I've only got like a Xerox of it that I found someplace, but and I did track down the artist's name, and of course forgot it at this moment.
So, Martin, you've been to Dunsany Castle. Actually, several of you have been to Dunsany Castle, and have met the Dunsanys, and I believe it's his. I believe he has 2 great grandsons who are alive. And of course, and if you want to go a little farther afield, there's of course the amazing Syme, his works, and I think he has a museum devoted to him himself as well. What's the Dunsanys? What are the Dunsanys like? Tell us about Downton Abbey.
It is Downton Abbey, believe me.
Yeah, well, it's very nice.
The castle dates to what? The 12th century?
Yes, it was built in the 1190s, and it was, I think, and it was first held by the Lacy family, and then in the let's see here, 1403, Sir Christopher Plunkett married the last de Lacy heiress, and got the 2 castles, Killeen and Dunsany. And so 2 of his sons, John and another Christopher, got 1 castle each. So the Killeen branch died out in 1984, but the Dunsany branch is still around. And I think they may be the Dunsany castle may be the building in Ireland that has been inhabited by the same family for the longest time. So which is quite cool. And it was rebuilt in the 18th century, and apparently Lord Dunsany's wife said at one point to, I think it was Bravely Camp, that if you want to rebuild a castle, the 18th century is the right time to do it.
I think they also mentioned that they were, I remember hearing this story from the camp, that they were going, in the 18th century, it all depended on whether or not the roof was still sound. They were going to abandon it if the roof wasn't good. But then the roof held, so the castle was rebuilt rather than judged.
But
They also have all the original illustrations that seem made for Dunsany's books, and they even have one of the very rare colored scenes in the bathroom of the illustration.
and believe me, you cannot judge those illustrations from the printed text. You got to look at the originals. I mean, there's so much more detail if you actually look at an original.
I assume the bathrooms were put in sometime after the 18th century?
Well, the thing is, and the current family doesn't really occupy more than a small part of this quite large castle. They just can't afford to keep it up. In fact, the castle is so difficult to heat in winter that they don't even try and just go around and wearing heavy coats the whole time. I mean, that's, when I first visited Dunsany Castle, it was right after the World Fantasy Convention in Brighton, 2013, and sure enough, I had to keep my coat on the whole time, just there for a day and a half.
They don't heat a few rooms that they actually live in?
Well, they try to, but the ceilings are so high that it's impossible to heat, really speaking.
If I can spin off from the Dunsany family on what I think might be an interesting tangent, but before I do that, I want to mention that Providence Athenaeum, where many of you visited, housing the Lovecraft bust, they had an Audubon elephant folio, worth millions and millions, and one of the plates used to hang in the bathroom for decades. And it was there, and it was under glass, it was in a frame, but I mean the glass would get spattered as people washed their hands and stuff, and then eventually they decided to sell the folio, and the plate is no longer there, but it was a very classy bathroom atmosphere to have.
But I'll quickly describe the trip that Martin and I took in 2014. We spent 2 weeks in July there, and that was a pure business trip because, in my previous visit to Dunsany Castle, I said, man, there's so many manuscripts here. We just have to get them in order, and not only and even correspondence and all this stuff. So Martin and I said, all right, we're going to have 2 weeks in July of 2014, and we're going to go through everything here, try to put them in boxes and folders and things like that. Our initial plan was also to tackle the correspondence. And I said, Martin, you deal with the literary manuscripts, I'll deal with the correspondence. But it became very obvious to us that simply wasn't going to be possible. There was way too much of everything. So we both focused on the literary manuscripts. And Martin focused on the short stories, putting them in order. Because what happened was that Dunsany or his agent or whatever would sometimes have these manuscripts folded up and crammed into these envelopes, and with labeled on the outside. Like, oh man, as an archivist, I just writhed in agony because you cannot keep manuscripts that way, even typescripts. So we did it all. I mean, I'll tell you, we got there whatever that day was. We worked from 8:30 in the morning to 11:30 at night.
Yeah.
We did not leave that castle for 8 days. We did not set foot outside the castle. There was so much to do.
Are the letters? Is there much? Well, did you get through the letters?
We didn't even touch the letter. We sort of looked and saw one. For example, I just randomly picked up a letter from P.G. Woodhouse to
Oh, sorry.
And there are letters by Dunsany, especially letters obviously written to Lady Dunsany, because obviously they'd be mailed to Castle. That's where he derived a lot of his information for those autobiographies, because they were on his travels. He wouldn't take her with him, so he would write these long letters back to her.
But can we get a selected letters of Lord Dunsany?
We could. It would take some effort because we'd have to get letters from other people, which are kind of scattered. That's the problem with doing is selected letters of anybody except somebody like Lovecraft, where most of the letters are at the Johnny Library. But when an author writes a letter, they end up being in the possession of the people he wrote to, so they get all scattered. But anyway, the point is about the literary manuscripts. Martin, found manuscripts of 500 or 600 stories. Is that right? Something like that.
Yeah,
I can't remember the exact number.
No, I can't remember the exact number.
And we have manuscripts of the novels. Sometimes he would write these novels in these big bound scrapbooks with very large handwriting. You only got 100 words a page, so something the manuscript, as it were. And I can't tell if it's an original manuscript or a fair copy or whatever.
It's a fair copy.
Yeah, of King of Elfland's Daughter is in 4 huge volumes because he doesn't. he writes so large in his quill pen that he didn't get a whole lot of words on a page. So there's that, there's hundreds of essays and reviews, 500 or 600 poems, maybe even more than that actually. You know, and the plays, I found like a dozen unpublished plays, a lot of them quite short, some of them like 2 pages, you know, and quite frankly, nothing earth-shaking among the unpublished plays, but they're kind of interesting. But go ahead.
He kept writing right up to the very end. In one of the notebooks there is his last story called A Great Lad, which was finished on the 15th of October of 1957. And then on the next page there is a brief note dated the 25th of October 1957 when he died, where he has written out his last wishes for where he wants to be buried. So that was actually written at the hospital.
Well, this productivity ties into what I was going to launch into a couple of seconds ago, is that when I read a biography of H. Rider Haggard, there was one like year, a 16-month period where he produced like 4 of the classic novels, and he was also, I think, a lawyer at the time, a practicing lawyer, and managing his estate. How did Dunsany, you know, and of course both men writing, you know, with by hand, not typing or computers, obviously. How did he maintain this productivity? Did he
Servants.
Okay, so he did have. Well, it was not like Haggard having to earn a living.
No, he was. I think there's considerable evidence that Dunsany had to write so much work, especially in 30s, 40s, 50s, because the estate was short of funds.
Okay, that's what I was.
And he just had to churn this stuff out and publish it wherever he could for whatever money he could get. Because the taxes were very high, still are in Ireland if you own that much property. How much, Martin? The estate in Dunsany's time, how many acres did he have?
I can't remember that. It's fairly extensive.
I mean, hundreds and hundreds of acres, and right now they're down to what? Maybe a mere 200 acres or something like that. He may have had like 1,200, 1,500 acres, who knows, at one time. And the property taxes were enormous in that day, and probably still are.
He was fortunate that it was really, really fast, because the story, you might be able to tell me this is actually true. Because the story goes that somebody from the BBC came to him to commission a play for the radio, and so Lady Dunsany sort of had tea served, and then took the guy for a walk in the garden, and when they came back, Lord Dunsany had written the play.
Yes, that did happen.
So when you're talking, did you meet Randall, the film director?
Yes, very nice guy. He loves horror movies and has made some of them himself.
He is the 21st Lord Dunsany. The writer was the 18th. He's a young man, about 30, 35 or thereabouts.
So does he have plans to make films of his ancestors?
I think he doesn't want to adapt his own great-grandfather's work. The one film he has made that I've seen is a 16-minute thing, a zombie film. And it was shown at the Lovecraft Film Festival a year or 2 ago in Portland, Oregon. I think he wants to do more horror rather than the fantasy. I think he would prefer to let other people do the Dunsany works themselves.
Dunsany in America. He came here how many times? Numerous?
At least. Well, he gave 2 major lecture tours, first in 1919 and 1920, which is when Lovecraft saw him at Copley Plaza in Boston. And then 1929, is that correct? Or something like that.
So were these like book tours or speakers?
Extensive lecture tours. Dunsany had become a darling of the American press around as early as 1915, and surprisingly, H.L. Mencken really got into Dunsany. I say surprisingly because Mencken otherwise was really generally a proponent of social realism, of the work of people like Fitzgerald and Dreiser and people like that. You wouldn't think that Mencken had much of a taste for fantasy, but I think he loved Dunsany's prose, and he loved James Campbell's prose also. So he and George G. Nathan at the Smart Set really did a lot to promote Dunsany, although I don't think they liked Dunsany as a person. They met him a couple times and found him a little off-putting.
I know Edmund Wilson referred to him as a foreign fowl.
Yeah.
But that's Edmund Wilson. You expect a comment like that from Edmund Wilson, but well, one thing again, it's something that the book collectors know. If you spend a lifetime going through bookstores, the signed Dunsanys you find, the common signed ones, are usually If or Tales of War, and these must have been the ones that were out That would be...
That would be around, what, 21?
21. Those are the ones from the new book that was out just as he came to do a tour. So lots of people got them signed. They always just signed the Dunsany.
Well, that's what a noble person does. When he published a letter in like the London Times, it would be just signed Dunsany. He wouldn't sign himself Lord Dunsany. It was understood that he was a lord.
He also visited California a number of times in the 1950s. He was friends with a fan in California named Hazel Littlefield Smith, who wrote a very charming little memoir of it called Lord Dunsany, King of Dreams, that I can't recommend it enough. It's a beautiful memoir.
Are you all fond of Mark Emery's biography of Dunsany?
No. It is one of the worst biographies ever written. I cannot begin to describe to you how bad it is. On so many levels. He simply wasn't even interested in Dunsany's work. He was hired by the estate to write this book.
You would expect a biography to at least have the birth date of the person it
But it contains a lot of... Well, back when it came out, it was, I think, valuable because we didn't know that much. The research in it is valuable. It told us a lot of things we didn't know. And in this sense, it's sort of like the camp biography of Lovecraft.
Well, it's actually much worse than the camp biography. So I understand your point, but there does need to be a new biography. I mean, maybe I'll do it. I would have to spend, some weeks at Dunsany Castle because there's so much of that correspondence and documentation. But it was a great place to be. I would go in summer where it's so. Actually, it becomes quite cool in summer. The castle, so that's all right. But
we know we've only scratched the surface, but we're actually almost out of time. So I think we should have some questions from the audience. The first person to raise his hand was this man. And maybe everyone else could get a line just so that we can have a clarity of who's.
Well, we'll just.
I know you guys don't like the Emery biography, but it's the only one available, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, it's either that or nothing for the time being until ST gets one.
I mean, my book, Dunsany, how do I call it, Master of the Anglo-Irish Imagination, is purely a critical study. I just
right.
One biographical chapter in it.
It's amazing to me that the manuscripts and the primary material has been preserved because it's not often the case. I'm on an e-group with a lot of writers and editors and stuff, and somebody just outside e-group just put a query to us. They said, I just bought a storage locker and it has all the papers and manuscripts of this woman, Suzette Haddon-Elgin.
No.
And yes, and then what should I do with it? You think a library wants it? And it's like, this has happened so often.
But if you own a castle, and you're a family that's been there since the 12th century,
you keep
there's a
stuff.
certain continuity.
Right, but that's the thing, it's so great that the stuff is out there because so often it's just lost or put in a dumpster.
Well, as a matter of fact, it's funny because when Mark and I were at the castle in 2014, as we were looking through this stuff, we said, there should be even more. Where is it? Or is there more? So we actually went up all the way into some sort of tower room or attic. I mean, literally, it's maybe where he worked. I can't remember. But we found a trunk that had a lot of other stuff on top. But we dug and dug and dug and said, oh God, there's whole more manuscripts and stuff way at the bottom of the trunk there. So, but it's there. No, they wouldn't have thrown it away.
Next question. Totally didn't see anybody. This fellow? Yes. Oh no.
Somebody in the back?
Somebody in the back.
Just about his influence on Tolkien and maybe...
Yeah, Ray, Faye, you should talk about that.
Well, that's actually quite a vexed question. Skye Cervoni, though, in this volume of critical essays on Lord Dunsany, purports to find some influences, but really the only intersection was in Tolkien's earliest days. He does admit to having read the earliest Dunsany, but by the time Tolkien goes into the Great War and comes out and he stops mentioning Dunsany altogether, and I don't know whether it's one of his anxiety of influence things.
Yes.
He's afraid that his mythology will be mistaken for Dunsany's mythology, but he kind of really separates himself. And when he was asked to submit something after The Hobbit, famous Tolkien story, The Hobbit is wildly successful. Alan and Unwin asks him do you have anything else? And instead of giving a manuscript, he bundles all the papers he's had on the Silmarillion that became the Silmarillion for over 20 years. He dumps them into a box and says, well, I have this. And weirdly enough, one of the readers for Allen and Unwin did go through it. And what they said was, this sounds altogether too Celtic, maybe like Dunsany. So that's the only the connection that somebody else made back then.
Speaking of Tolkien, I can add that Tolkien and Dunsany are the only fantasy writers I know about who have been nominated for the Nobel Prize. Dunsany was nominated in 1950, and Tolkien was nominated in, I think, 1960, 61 by C.S. Lewis.
Dunsany lost to Bertrand Russell, a good person to lose to. Not sure who Tolkien lost to. Anyway, anybody else?
Yeah, okay. Partly, I was also asking about Dunsany's possible influence on Tolkien. Let me expand on what was his influence, because Tolkien and Howard are very influential on modern fantasy. So what did Lord Dunsany have any influence on, say, Robert E. Howard, or perhaps C.S. Lewis, or perhaps Mervyn Peake?
I think we can answer a little bit of that. Well, the main thing to keep in mind is that none of these writers thought of themselves as part of a field. They weren't part of a genre. They were independent writers who were simply literary men. So they didn't feel any need to keep up. Well, for example, we know that actually that Tolkien actually read the Conan stories and liked them. He told Spriggan Camp that. But Dunsany, well, he would have to have been familiar with James Stephens. And we know he read an introduction to The Hill of Dreams, so he probably read some Arthur Machen. But basically, writers of this sort didn't grow up out of fantasy fandom keeping up with the field. It's a very different mindset.
Although I think it's pretty clear. I mean, look, Dunsany's influence on people like Smith and some of the later fantasy traditions seems pretty clear to me.
Well, I think in that case, by the time you even get to Smith or the Weird Tales writers, they have a coherent sense that they are a field and this is a community. Whereas Dunsany or Tolkien or Peake were totally isolated.
Yeah, it's kind of analogous in science fiction with Olaf Stapledon, where he did not know the pulp writers, and he was rather horrified when he was introduced to, somewhat horrified to think that his great cosmic novels had anything in common with, the pulp stuff that was appearing.
Do we know anything about how Dunsany felt about being published in Famous Fantastic Mysteries? One time he was actually in a pulp.
I don't recall anything he says about it. He was grateful for the money he must have gotten somewhere.
That check went to help with the roof repair.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else?
I think you were in.
Was there much of a conference between H.P. Lovecraft and Lord Dunsany? And if there was, what were the main topics they wrote about in the letters?
We'd have to have a whole other panel on that one.
Yeah.
There's so much to say about the Lovecraft Dunsany connection. Daryl's written a lot of good pieces.
Well, no, he's asking specifically, is there correspondence?
No,
no.
That's an easy answer.
Dunsany only found out about Lovecraft at all, even though when Dunsany gave that talk in Boston where Lovecraft first saw him, Dunsany was like sitting, Lovecraft was sitting in the front row, so they're 10 feet apart, but they didn't meet.
Lovecraft said he didn't want to get Dunsany's autograph because I don't fawn upon the great.
But there's a little correspondence between Dunsany and August Derleth. I think what
Derleth had sent him the second Lovecraft novel was Beyond the Wall of Sleep.
Or there's a Dunsany story in the Arkham Sampler. And anyway,
it may have sent him Marginelli because it had his Lord Dunsany in his work.
Yeah, but anyway, the story of the sign is published in the Arkham Sampler where the dream quest about Unkadef was being serialized. And
Dunsany wrote earlier to Derleth. In 1944, there is a letter from Dunsany to Derleth saying, "Oh yeah, I read some of these Lovecraft stories, and they seem to be working in my manner, but they're not quite original, and they're just sort of an homage to me, but they're by no means just imitations."
He also says something like, "Well, he started writing in my style, my early style. He's kind of welcome to it."
Yeah. No, but he liked those early Lovecraft stories. He thought they were pretty good.
Arthur C. Clarke corresponded with Dunsany for a while and sent him the copy of the Arkham sampler that contained the dream quest of Al-Mukhallaf, saying that he might be interested in this, and Dunsany commented fairly positively on that. And he also, Dunsany also wrote to August Derleth asking specifically about Lovecraft's article, Lord Dunsany and his work. So Dunsany said something like I've heard about this article that you have in this book, Marginalia, and it sounds interesting. Could you send me a copy of it? And Derleth didn't send him a copy of Marginalia, but I did find the galley proof for that particular article among Dunsany's papers, so he got that at least. I don't know what his reaction
Well, of course,
to
a couple of years later, Derleth was publishing the fourth book of
Well, he
Jurgens.
signed up, Dunsany, to publish the American edition of the fourth book of Jurgens. It came out in '48, so it must have been some years before that.
This is an article. You really need to put this together because his question is an excellent one, and a lot of Lovecraft scholars would be interested.
Yeah.
Next question?
Yes, our distinguished colleague Ken Fagg, the celebrated Lovecraftian genealogist and epicure, which was reprinted by Hippocampus, parcel posted me half a dozen invaluable books, including two by Dunsany. One was a sort of a travelogue called My Ireland, and the other one was The Gorilla.
Yeah, that's a war novel, a World War II novel. That's the one that Robert Penn Warren thought was a pretty good piece of work when he reviewed it.
Versatile, if anything.
So that was really written for a contest. He wrote it from above.
Yeah, I don't think it's a great book,
good.
but whatever. Apparently
I've added a prose Dunsanian pastiche towards my next book. And so I hope that they won't exclude it because it's not poetic.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, when is the collected plays going to come out?
As soon as we can get permission from the goddamn estate. They are difficult to work with, or actually their agents, Curtis Brown, are sometimes a little difficult to work with, but we have ways to get around them. I think Martin's going to work on this, but the book, I already have I wouldn't say a galley, but printout of this huge stack of, it's pretty much compiled. I have to write some commentary and
How many unpublished plays are
now I think there are almost at least a dozen, perhaps more. One major one that was quite good, A Strange Lover?
Strange Lover.
The Strange Lover, I can't remember. Basically, a story of the Frankenstein's monster told from his point of view. Very, very interesting. A full-length play. The typescript was 180 pages or so. That's like a full 3-act play.
Was it
Very.
unproduced as well as
It may actually have been produced. It was a very late play, written in the 30s or even the 40s, I can't remember. May have been produced kind of locally, in Ireland or somewhere, but certainly never published.
What's the state of Dunsany theatrical productions? I mean, are any scripts available in the standard?
No, unfortunately not. I mean, one of his great plays, I think, Mr. Faithful, which is again, it's a delightful play, was published in a Samuel French acting edition in '35, and they kept that in print quite a long time, but I don't think that's in print now.
Despite which it's awesomely rare.
It's very scarce, yeah.
The only copy I've ever seen for sale at any price ever was about a few years ago on eBay, and it was like $500, and they said, and Daryl Schweitzer says how rare this is.
Well, yeah, I think the only Dunsany book that I don't have in an actual book, I had a photocopy of it from a library.
But of course, I pointed out, it's in the Ginger Cat.
Yeah. It is a
So it's
delightful
easy.
play.
You
It's another sort of man-dog thing. I won't even tell you any more about it, but it's just delightful.
The rarest Dunsany publications would be the stuff that he wrote for various on-ship journals that when he went across the Atlantic. On the ship, they would sometimes have a newspaper that was put out once a day.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And he sometimes wrote like little stories or at least poems for those. And so those newspapers were available only on that particular ship. So that would be fabulously rare. I don't know if they have been preserved, but I think they have. I think I remember seeing a couple of copies at Dunsany Castle.
Next question. Oh, I think you've been asking for a while. Yes, here.
Yes, I independently discovered Dunsany twice, actually, before learning of his connection to Lovecraft. The first time was in the late 60s as a sort of byproduct of my interest in William Morris. Then a few years later, I read an essay about him, or maybe it was about him in Tennessee more generally, by Ursula Le Guin.
Yeah, Le Guin has been, you know, a great champion of Dunsany and presumably influenced by him also.
Yeah, I think the other avenue for discovering, the one other avenue other than Lovecraft is the Irish Renaissance. You know, if you were in college in the 60s or 70s, the one way that Dunsany was still respectable, I actually got to write one of the chapters of my book. I used a really enormous term paper once, the one about the plays, because the connection with the Irish Renaissance and with Yeats and the Abbey Theatre, that was still respectable literature and regarded as worthy of.
Well, although
knew
later on, certainly after Ireland broke from England, Dunsany was, shall we say, on the wrong side of history.
No, I mean
in
an American university.
Right, sure. Yes. Because the Irish, the Irish were highly prejudiced against Dunsany because he was a loyalist. He did not want to break from England. And he was a lord. He was a titled nobleman, presumably one of the idle rich. Though they really did not like Dunsany, and Irish compilations of the writers from the Irish Renaissance almost deliberately excluded him until recently.
Yeah.
They have now started to embrace him again because the passions that governed that period have presumably dissipated a bit. So now they welcome him.
I don't know if anyone's been in Dublin at the Irish Writers Museum more recently, but in 2007 at least, he wasn't in there. He was not even mentioned. Bram Stoker had made it in. He wouldn't have been in a few years before, but Dunsany had not. But during the Troubles, the castle was attacked, right?
Yeah.
I'm not quite
It was
sure.
not burned as some of the other castles were, but
The Douglas Cathcart estate was Horace Plunkett.
that's right, yes.
Yeah, and poor Horace Plunkett's house was burned, but Dunsany Castle wasn't. So that's a bit ironic. Dunsany described his uncle as something of his role in politics was something like that of a dog at a tennis game. Both sides would stop playing to shoo him off the
Perhaps we have time for one more question. And I think you.
I was just curious if you know what influence, if any, Dunsany had on Lovecraft's short story, The Moonbog?
The Moonbog, yeah, I think that could be considered. Well, okay, that's a weird instance because that's a story about some American guy who comes over to Ireland, reclaims his property, wants to drain a bog on his property and, develop it or something, but the spirits of Ireland or something come back and avenge him. That story was written in 1921. In fact, it was written for like a St. Patrick's Day literary contest, among the amateur journalists. Almost, I wouldn't say exactly, but very close in plot. The Curse of the Wise Woman written in 1933.
Yes.
There's no way that obviously, there's no way Lovecraft could have influenced Dunsany. That's preposterous. But no way that Dunsany's novel could have influenced Lovecraft unless he time travel somehow. So that's a weird case of literary parallelism. It may be that story was influenced by some other works of Dunsany, although offhand not really come to mind.
I think the Moonbog is actually set in County Meath, where Dunsany Castle is.
Sure.
So there's a tendency.
Well, he makes these little references to Dunsany, but I'm not sure that the plot or the imagery is influenced by that.
No, I think he's right. It was probably inspired by seeing Dunsany, but maybe nothing more specific.
Possibly reading about Dunsany may have been pretty much what he knew about Ireland.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. One aspect of this whole panel and Dunsany's status today is that, as with so many writers, it's fantasy fandom that keeps him alive. They're not talking about Dunsany at the MLA this year, I don't think. Here's a writer who deserves to be preserved and so influential and still fun to read, and it's only thanks to, not to pat ourselves on the back, but that this is why he's still alive, is conferences like this.
A lot of his plays are on Project Gutenberg and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, the early ones, presumably, because again, they're out of copyright, but there are lots of later plays that are also really good.
Well, we're about 12 minutes till the hour, so I think, although there's so much more we can talk about, technically the panel is over, so thank you all so much for coming here.